our series of monthly webinars we do on Agile/software development topics. The topic today is acceptance and story testing. That one of the biggest challenges of software development has been working on the right requirements in the right way, and the concept of acceptance acceptance test effectively and execute Scrum Trainer and Coaching, and how she's been in the software industry for 15+ years as a practitioner and as a coach and trainer. He's been involved with Scrum since 2008, and I've had how to most effectively execute and automate them to a large audience. I'm delighted to have Charles to present this topic of acceptance and story testing patterns. So Charles, with that, over to you.
All right, thank you, Hemant. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today and to talk about this topic. As Hemant said, I will talk to you today about how to define acceptance tests, and preferably earlier in the process as possible. We'll touch on test automation and maybe a couple of strategies around that, but this is really not a test automation talk. This is a how do you define your requirements in such a way that you deliver the functionality that your users want, and then we'll talk again a little bit about how you might automate that, because that is the end goal. So we'll just go ahead and get started. I understand there's a small delay in between when I switch slides and when you see them, so I'll try my best to keep that to a minute. And I've asked him to let me know if that doesn't happen. So anyway, let's start off with why you should care. Why should I care about story testing patterns? The two biggest things are you want to increase productivity and efficiency, and you want to enable more test automation. And the way you increase the productivity and efficiency is by identifying those tests up front before development begins, and that helps you flesh out a lot of non-obvious test scenarios. Once you've done that, which is often referred to as acceptance test-driven development, then it makes it much easier to automate your tests, and the tests can be automated while the code is being written, literally in parallel. And there's actually a few advanced teams out there that actually write a lot of their automated tests before code is written, and then the programmers can actually run the tests as they're programming until all the tests pass green. So that's kind of an ideal situation. It's not one many teams find themselves in, but the more you move yourself closer to automated test development, the more you get towards that agile specification and working software over comprehensive documentation. So what we'll talk about today, we'll spend about 15% of our time just on a quick review of user stories so you all understand what exactly user stories are. And then I'll spend about half of the time on the basic story testing patterns. And the reason I do that, there's 4 of those, and the reason I do that is because you'll use those probably 70 or 80% of the time in the field. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on patterns that you will use rarely. So what we'll do is we'll do an exercise kind of in the middle that I've adapted for this online webinar. There's 3 examples. I don't think we're going to get to the third one today, but I put it in there, and the answers are in there so that you can review it later. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end. It may feel a little bit rushed towards the end, but I'll just show you some examples of 2 advanced story testing patterns and 2 special story testing patterns. And again, those are going to be kind of rarely used. So the other thing I want to mention is my slides are quite detailed, and I do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's easier for you to be able to review afterwards and remember what I said. I know this is against convention a little bit, but the other reason is because I don't want you to take a bunch of notes as we go along. So obviously this will be up on Synerzip's website, so you can certainly review it later. My hope is that you'll be able to listen in, and details you can kind of follow up on later by looking back at the slides. I also may not hit every word on every slide. So just keep that in mind. So in order for us to get started, I think we need to have a good conversation about what a user story really is. A user story is often talked about as a card, a conversation, and a set of test confirmations. Now, these test confirmations have a lot of names for them. Some people call them acceptance tests, test confirmations, acceptance criteria. I try to call them story tests as often as possible. What we're talking about here are the sort of things that prove that your story works correctly. We're not talking about the necessarily automated tests. We're talking about conceptual tests that can then be easily automated. So by story tests, what we're really talking about is how can we confirm that this story was done correctly? One other small note, user stories are not part of Scrum. They are one good way to represent product backlog items in Scrum. And I should also mention that user stories can be used really in any software development practice, not just Scrum. They just tend to go well with Scrum. So I want to make that clear. You can use it really in any methodology. So one thing I want to mention here, there's a common misconception out there in the industry that if you write a sentence like as a blank, I want some blank so that some value is achieved as a user story, and that's really not a user story. I argue that's about a third of a user story in that it sort of represents the card or the reminder to have a conversation, and it's really the least important part. It's just one quick reminder to have some conversations, and so again, going back to the card, conversation, confirmations, the sentence there that you see on the screen is a card. The conversations are obvious. You have those around the details. And then what you hope to do is, out of the conversations, you want to get the story test or the acceptance test so that you'll know when that story is correct, complete, and done. So this, as a user, think it's the worst practice. But thinking that the user story is a single sentence to me is kind of a worst practice. So
yeah, Charles, can we take one question along the flow?
Sure, absolutely. So we can take more questions. Please feel free.
Okay, so let me ask this question that came in here.
Yeah.
The story tests, you define them by definition. Therefore, are they the happy path test only?
Oh, no, no, no. Happy, sad, bad, you should do all of them. A lot of times what teams do is they'll identify like the most important paths up front, and then as they're developing the story, they'll discover a few they didn't think about, and they just add those as story tests, and that completes the story. And so long as it doesn't blow your estimate out of the water, no big deal. You just incorporate those into the story by collaboration.
Okay, excellent.
Feel free to jump in questions from time to time. All right, so what I also want to mention here, what I'm talking about today is not documentation technique. There is, of course, a tendency in old school sort of waterfall thinking that, document everything and anything about requirements. User stories were not meant to be a documentation technique. They were meant to be a conversation and confirmation technique. So they're not living documents that are maintained like use cases used to be. User stories only talk about the new behavior of a system. And they're not strict contracts either. Like I said, the collaborations can happen, as a result of once you dive into the details of a story, often things will arise that you think of in advance, and that's okay. We're not all forecasters of the future, so it's okay to incorporate that in as you go along, so long as you make it fit in your process nicely. So I talked about what story tests are not. Let's talk about what they are. They're communication and testing techniques. So they're not a documentation technique, but they are a communication technique. They're the results of the collaboration and the conversations. In Scrum, they're typically done during backlog grooming before development begins, at least at a conceptual level. You may not flush out every case like I mentioned before, but at least you understand the basic cases. I would just say you need at least one happy and at least one sad path, and usually more is better. And ideally, you want your story test automated to create that agile specification such that when some other part of the system gets changed in a way that's against the way the system is supposed to work, a test breaks, which alerts everybody that a conversation needs to happen. So maybe it's okay that the test broke because there's new behavior, or maybe it's not okay because we're breaking old behavior. And that's one of the ways you can get away with less documentation with user stories is if you have your story tests automated. If you don't have them automated, of course, you could certainly keep the story test documentation you do have. But again, We're trying to get away from the documentation and towards the collaboration and the executable Agile specification. And relating this back to the Agile Manifesto, we value working software over comprehensive documentation and individuals and interactions via collaboration and backlog and things like that over processes and tools. So 2 story tests that always apply to any user story, whether you say it or don't say it, is that the old behavior still works correctly, and that the product owner has accepted the story. If you're doing Scrum, if you're doing XP, it's the customer, and if you're doing other flavors of Agile, then it's whoever sort of accepts the work. So these things always apply, so you don't need to repeat them for every story that you write or that you communicate. And I just want to make a best practice, always get immediate sign-off. You want to shorten those feedback loops as much as possible. So something that's common in Scrum is people will wait to the end of the sprint to get sign-off from their product owner. I suggest don't do that. Get sign-off from your product owner as soon as you think the story is done. A sprint review is really for the stakeholders, not the product owner.
Charles, let's take another question along the way here. So the question, and I'll modify just a bit to make it more general. How do you justify the investment of time and resources in handling acceptance test automation during the sprint rather than just keeping them manual? Is there advice on how to justify that investment?
Well, here's the thing. There's going to be a little bit of an upfront cost in terms of learning curve if you've never automated tests before. So that, that's going to pay back. It's going to pay back over months and years. But once you get to where you can kind of automate these tests, and you don't have to automate 100% of your tests at the beginning, you can start small and grow it bigger. What you're going to find is that once you automate that test, it's going to run hourly, daily, in perpetuity. And if you have a tool like Hudson or a similar continuous integration tool, every time somebody checks in code, the tests are run, and your team is immediately alerted to an issue that needs to be dealt with. And again, sometimes the issue is a broken test, and sometimes it's because behavior has changed. We need to change the test. So I think the key thing to remember here is what we're doing is we're automating the process of manual testing. And what the opposite of doing it that way is trying to go all manual. And typically what happens with teams then is you end up with a huge amount of technical debt, legacy code, testing debt, and you end up where a system has to be rewritten every 5 years. That's how you can really tell if your system is healthy and has a lot of technical debt, is if you're having to rewrite it every 5 years. Good Agile teams are able to adapt along, keep their automated tests sweet pretty good, and when they need to make changes to the system, they make them incrementally, and they don't have to rewrite a system every 5 years. So I would just say, think about the cost to rewrite your system, because that's always 3 times as much as you think it's going to be, because everybody's forgotten how much logic is there. Now, instead, for about 1/10 of that cost, let's automate some tests. That's how I would justify it.
Yeah, let's just do one other clarification. I think for the audience, the question is, when you say test, do you mean functionality or UI test? It might be just useful to clarify that, Charles.
And I'll touch on this later, but I mean both. And we'll talk. I'm going to show you the testing pyramid later in the presentation. And I'll talk a little more about that a little bit later. I promise I'll come back to that. I got a slide for that. Okay, well, how we're going to proceed is each pattern category. I'm going to give you a little advice on the communication means. What I mean by pattern category is the basic versus the advanced versus the special patterns. I'll give you some advice there, because again, I think it's important to stress that we don't want to create heavyweight documentation type processes. And then for each pattern, I'm going to give you a description of the pattern, some context on when it's a good time to apply that pattern versus a bad time to apply that pattern, and then I'm going to give an example or two for each of the patterns, just so you have a practical example that you can then model your testing off of. So what we'll do is we'll start here with the basic story testing patterns. These are the ones that are used roughly 80% of the time. First, we'll talk about a pattern that's called test that, and then we'll talk about given when then, which is a pattern you've probably heard of, or some of you have. Then we'll talk about 2 flavors of specification by example, and specification by example uses examples of how the logic would work in particular situations, particular data. We'll talk about 2 flavors. One's a conceptual sort of version of specification by example, and the other is the concrete version. So for these basic story testing patterns, the best communication mediums for these particular patterns is something like a wiki or a whiteboard. Um, that's really the best choice. If you can't do that, then the handwritten notes on a 5x8 card is kind of second best. And then your last resort is some sort of word processing document. The worst thing to use for these particular tools is pretty much every ALM tool that's out there. The ALM tools don't have a lot of good support for inline tables and images and things like that. They do. Some of them are getting better in that area, but generally speaking, I try to create the communication medium that is the most efficient and effective among a software development team. And I just find that the ALM tools in this area aren't very strong. In other areas, they are kind of strong, but not this one. So here's a thing to think about as you go along and you're doing these things, right? How much?
ALM. Let me just define ALM.
Oh, thank you.
So for those who don't know, ALM is Application Lifecycle Management Tools. These are many of the software tool suites out there to manage software development process. You know, the likes of Rallies and version ones and so on. There are many others.
Yes, exactly. Greenhopper, those kinds of tools.
Right.
So one thing again, I want you to keep in mind here: we're not creating a documentation technique, but that at the same time, sometimes you do need to document a little bit. So try to optimize your documentation to the minimum amount that could possibly work, and experiment with what that amount is. And the way you'll know if it's working is if the product owner is often pointing out a lot of things that weren't done that were already talked about in previous conversations. This is a sign that you might need to just take a few more notes next time. But if it rarely happens, then maybe you should try documenting less going forward. You know, and just iterate your way to the optimum amount of documentation. This will vary completely differently for every team, for every domain, things like that. So again, remember to always kind of optimize that line of how much documentation versus how little documentation of these story tests. So the first pattern is the test that pattern. And the technique for the test that pattern is you start a sentence with the words test that. And then you put in some new behavior that happens given the new functionality. Less frequently, you may want to still test that some really important old behavior still works correctly. But again, we're really documenting new behavior more so than old behavior. The problem with documenting every single test that statement for every piece of behavior in your system is you end up with stories way, way long, and you don't want that. They should be able to fit on a 5x8 card if necessary. So that's really what we want to do here. It's a conceptual test. Usually don't use specific test data. So this one is good for situations where you're kind of a beginning story tester because you can pretty much say anything by starting off a sentence with test that something happens, right? It's really good for simple tests, and it's really good for tests that are hard to describe using any of the other patterns. It's sort of like your fallback pattern if you can't make it work in one of the more intermediate to advanced patterns. It's really bad. The test that pattern is really bad for, if you know of a more efficient pattern, right? And it's really bad for tests that have a lot of setup logic or behavior because you start out writing test that, when this happens, that happens, and that happens, in this situation, and that situation, then this thing should happen, right? It gets really wordy. Sometimes you're writing a test that story test, and it starts getting really wordy. Think about using one of the other patterns because probably another one of the patterns fits better. And then test where behavior depends on numerous test inputs. Again, you're like, well, if they put in X here and Y there and Z there, again, your sentence is going to get wordy, which means it's probably better represented in a different pattern. And I'll show you some of those patterns as we talk here. So this is a concept. I'm using some of the examples, and it's one of those things that pretty much shows up in every system that's out there. You have this change password screen where you have to enter your old password, then you have to enter your new password, and then you have to confirm your new password. And probably the password has to comply with a certain, password policy of at least 8 characters or whatever. So I wanted to give you a visualization of some of the examples use this one. And I'm hoping it's a story that everybody kind of understands. It'll obviously be a lot different in every system, but just sort of a basic concept as we talk about these examples. So here's some examples. This next slide will show you some examples of the test that strategy, test that pattern. So I've numbered AT1, AT2. Don't pay too much attention to the numbers, it's just so you can note the difference between different story tests. I'm gonna be silent here for about 30 seconds while you read these sentences.
Yeah, just be careful that screen has not refreshed yet. So it does.
Okay.
On the test.
Yeah, my indicator is showing 99% of screens have refreshed, but 1% has not. Maybe you're the 1%.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I'll be quiet here for another 30 seconds just to kind of give people a chance to catch up and read. Still at 99% for some reason.
So I'm the 1%, but that's good. I'm okay.
Well, assuming that's accurate. It may not be accurate. I don't know. But in any event, I'll talk a little bit about them. The first one's test that when a user enters an incorrect password, they get an error message indicating the incorrect credentials, right? And then I have another one that talks about, well, if they do 3 incorrect submissions of the old password within an hour, then we log them out of the system, things like that. And then the last couple of tests, you'll notice they're completely different. They're not related to the password stuff at all. One is talking about kind of user interface behavior. Remember I said this pattern is good for user interface type things. Test that when a user clicks on the continue shopping link, it takes them to the home page, right? So these are some examples of the test that strategy. Sentence with the word test that. So, moving on to the next pattern, and again, I'm trying to sort of speak in a way that is in line with at least 99% of you that have gotten your slide refreshed. So in this pattern, it's also kind of word-based or prose-based. You say 3 things: given, when, then. It's called given, when, then. It's also known as the Gherkin style. Given some particular test setup or precondition, when some particular trigger event happens, then the new behavior happens. Or again, we might want to test some really important old behavior. So this one, you might use specific test data, or you might not. It's kind of up to you what particular scenario it is. And then you can use an and or an or to join the statements. Like you might say, given a admin type user and they have not logged in within 24 hours, when they log in, then display the last time they logged in on the screen or something like that, right? So this technique, you fill in the blanks there, and the given, when, then, and that kind of gives you a pretty flexible way of creating a test scenario. It's sometimes called behavior-driven development. Now, this particular technique is really good for situations that require a lot of setup or preconditions to understand, or they require a lot of setup that's important or easily forgotten. So what I mean there by important or easily forgotten is that, in the previous example when we were showing change password screen, we said tested an incorrect password, blah, 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 right? Well, obviously you have to get to the screen. And in a case where a team totally understands or has a shared understanding of how you get to that screen, you don't need to document the setup behavior. But when you do have setup behavior that's important, or you might forget in between the time you have the conversation and the time you implement code and tests, given, when, then might be a better way of doing it because you want to remember all those preconditions. So we've all implemented code with very complex logic, and this is kind of what given, when, then is designed for. So when you have a non-obvious trigger, again, is a good time to use given, when, then, and then test when there are few expected outputs. Again, if you have this situation where, depending on situation or inputs, you have 5 different expected outputs, then you're going to be writing a lot of prose, a lot of words, and we don't really want to do that. So one of those patterns I'm going to show you is a pattern to use in that kind of scenario. This one is really bad for simple tests because you have to do the given, when, then thing. It seems like a lot of writing for just a very simple test. So I would encourage you to use the test that. Or if the setup and the preconditions are obvious or unimportant to the testing, then you don't need to use this pattern. Maybe you can just use the test that pattern or one of the next ones I'm about to show you. tests where there's multiple different inputs and outputs, and tests where a single, given when then only describes one of very, very numerous simple scenarios. Again, in that situation, you're going to end up writing a lot of words, and it's just kind of an inefficient use of your time. So the next time I show you will be better for that situation. So here's some examples on the given when then. Here we are back to the change password thing. Given that a user has submitted an incorrect old password 2 times in the last hour, when the user submits an incorrect password for the 3rd time, then the system logs the user out, and the system displays a customer service phone number and then a message telling them to call customer service. Something you may have also noticed as I've gone along here is that we don't specify really tiny details like the customer service phone number or the messaging that we're going to use. I would suggest that's better done in a collaboration, and it's also one of those tricks of documenting things that you don't want to document things that are very likely to change, or a few words are going to change. Then you're going to spend all your time editing documents. And again, we're not about documents here. We're about conversations. We're about discussions. So I would encourage you to do small details like that in a way that's better had in a conversation. And frankly, if you're in a backlog room session and talking about this particular test, and you say the system needs to display the customer service phone number, chances are somebody knows how to look that up on your website. You don't need to record it here with your actual test. So, and you remember we're recording these tests like on a wiki or on a card or something like that. So again, just leave small details out that are likely to be remembered. Small details that are likely to be forgotten, you might want to jot those down. So here's another example of a given when then. In this case, I've joined several clauses with an and and an or. So we have given that the user is logged in and the user is an admin user, or the user's account has been flagged by fraud. There's some pretty extensive setup and trigger events here that might be easily forgotten. So this is why the given when then pattern is probably a really good one for this particular example. So the next pattern is called Specification By Example. And the technique is that you create a table of the most important examples or testing scenarios that specify inputs and outputs. And if any of you have seen the tool Fitness or Fit, this is similar to the decision table concept. The key with this technique is to be sure to create enough examples to exercise all the logic paths. So again, we're trying to look at examples of going through the system. Now, this particular pattern, and I haven't broken it down to the conceptual and concrete yet, and the reason for that is that the same context applies to both, the same pattern context. So both flavors of it are good for tests that have numerous inputs and outputs. Or a different way of thinking about it is tests that require a lot of different data scenarios. That's usually like your intent should go up when you have a particular user story where there's a lot of different data scenarios. Immediately your intent should go up and say, hey, that sounds like a specification by example thing. Let's make a list of the most important examples and make sure it exercises all of our logic, and we're good, right? Tests where the trigger event is somewhat obvious is good for that. Any tests where it seems like a table would help you, explore all the possible inputs and outputs.
Charles, let's take one question. All the data at the end also just as well. The question is essentially says who writes these stories and the test. Is this, would you think that's a full-time job? So the question, I guess, if I paraphrase, is the product owner writing the acceptance test along with the stories, or is it a QA who's writing these acceptance tests? Who writes it, and what kind of a time allocation are we talking here?
Okay, good question. First of all, I don't like using the term writing user stories or writing story tests because, again, we're not talking about documentation technique, we're talking about collaboration technique. But I think your point is still the same. Who creates these story tests, these acceptance criteria, and when do they do it? And is it a full-time job, right? So, first of all, who does it? Well, the Scrum Guide was actually changed about a year ago on this exact topic, and it had to do with who manages the product backlog. It used to be that the product owner was responsible for managing the entire product backlog and making sure that user stories were communicated well to the team so that the team has a shared understanding. About a year ago, the Scrum Guide changed to say that while the product owner is certainly the decision maker on what correct behavior is, who actually specifies the tests and sort of maintains the acceptance criteria is up to each Scrum team to decide, and generally speaking, the product owner is the decision maker, but who actually does the legwork can be either the product owner or the development team or a combination of the two. So it really is going to vary by team. I don't think it's really a full-time job for one person, generally speaking. What that implies to me is that if it's a full-time job for one person, it implies to me that there's one person you have that's sort of in charge of requirements, a requirements analyst. And while I think requirements analysts are very valuable in certain scenarios, I don't think every team needs one of those. Also, I don't want to relegate the product owner role to a requirements analyst because they do a lot more than just make decisions about requirements. So the truth of the matter is I'd like to see the entire team be involved in it. Who actually does the legwork is less important than making sure the team has a shared understanding, including the product owner, has a shared understanding of what's going on. Typically on Scrum teams, the way this is done is 1 hour a week. They do what's called backlog grooming. And I have some articles on my website about backlog grooming, and there's plenty all over the internet about backlog grooming. Just search for Scrum backlog grooming, and you'll find lots of articles on that. But basically, it's once a week for about an hour or two. The product owner gets together with the Scrum team, and they work this stuff out, and they usually are working on the stories that are for the next sprint during the groom. So you don't groom stuff that you're currently working on because hopefully the stuff you're currently working on is already groomed and ready to go, right? We want to create these things before development begins, if at all possible. Okay? So the specification by example, I'll just reiterate the reasons you might want to use it. It's good for things with numerous inputs and outputs. The reasons that you might not use it are for simple tests. If it's really simple and you're going to have a one-line table, that's not really effective. And I gave an example here of a user interface behavior, just kind of a one-off thing. You might use the test that pattern instead. And then tests where there's really only one input or precondition. Again, you're going to have a 1 or 2 line table, and it's not going to make a lot of sense to put it in a table. Just put it in a sentence, either when the enter test that will work fine. So notice that each of these patterns has a context for which it's good to apply that particular pattern. And generally speaking, if it doesn't fit that context, then you probably should use one of the other patterns because that's probably better suited to the requirement or the situation that you're dealt with. So I've been promising to talk to you about the difference between the conceptual versus the concrete versions of specification by example. And then the basic difference is this. In the conceptual form, you don't use specific test data. You just kind of describe the data conceptually. And I'll show you an example of this in a minute, so it'll make more sense what I'm talking about. For the concrete form, you're going to use actual test data and test scenarios that you can then run into your automated tests or manual tests, whichever you're doing. The reason you might go one way versus the other way is the conceptual form is usually sort of the easiest to do, like in backlog grooming when you're having conversations about this. Oftentimes you might have the exact test data with you. The concrete form is actually better, but it's harder for teams to actually set all that up and have all the concrete test data before development begins. So sometimes you might start with the conceptual and move to the concrete, and I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. So speaking of the example, waiting for the slide to refresh for everybody. This one's got an image on it, so it might take a little longer to refresh for everybody. So here's an example of specification by example using the conceptual model, and it's on a wiki page. Okay, and there's a little wiki table with some text below. And this one's moderately complex, and one of the reasons I like to show moderately complex examples from time to time is to show that these are techniques you can use even complicated logic. A lot of the simple logic in software is done and over with and was done 10, 15 years ago. Anymore, the systems we work on are very, very complex. The logic is very detailed because we live in a global, competition market. So this particular one is a conceptual form of the specification by example. And here we are with the change password thing again, right? Same change password screen. You notice I have 9 different scenarios. This may not be every single scenario, but it's enough to really exercise all the logic. And you notice that the expected messages for each particular scenario are different. Because we may want to tell them that, you're about to have your account locked because you've entered an incorrect password 3 times. Or in a different case, you might want to tell them that their new password doesn't conform to the password rules. Things like that, just to help them get the data correctly. So you'll notice the 3 columns on the left, the current password, new password again, have a question mark. That means they're inputs. And I think that's a fitness sort of convention that's used in the fitness testing tool. And then on the right side, the expected is the expected output. So, like for instance, line number 3, I enter the current password, which is correct. It's the correct current password. Then I enter a new password that's valid, which means it passes the password rules and things. And then I enter the new password again, confirm, and it was successful, right? And so that's the success message. But if you look at row number 2, I enter the correct password, but I leave the new password field blank, and then there's a star in the next column. And if you look down below, the asterisk means that it's any and all possible values. So no matter what I enter in the new password field, in that scenario, I'm still going to get the same error message. So it doesn't matter what I enter. So this is what I mean by conceptual. I'm conceptually talking about, what you enter for the password. And on the next screen, I'm going to show you what it looks like with actual test data. And so these are the 2 flavors of specification by example pattern. So the next slide, if you look, so the next slide, I kind of indicate some stuff up in the wiki page about what the password rules are and stuff. And then in the actual table itself, I use actual test data. I'm either going to put blank in, or in this case, the current password is Skywalker. And so if you notice up in the text at the top, I said this user's current password is Skywalker. So that is actual test data for a particular account, test account. And these are actual values that I would enter and run in a test. Now, you can do these manually, but I think you can see just by looking at this table, there's at least 15 different scenarios, and most of them are fairly important. We didn't put a bunch of junky scenarios in here. It'd be much better to exercise this with a automated test. And again, I've got a slide later where I talk about how you sort of decide exactly where that's tested, in the UI or in the service layer or whatever. So that's the specification by example pattern. And again, conceptual, when you don't have all the test data handy, but you want to exercise all the logic, and then the concrete when you want to actually specify the actual test data that you're going to use, the actual expected outputs and stuff. So before we get to the exercises, Hema, do you have any questions burning on the chat window, or just continue on with all the examples?
You can continue with all the burning questions on the way.
Okay, cool. So here's an example 1. I'm waiting for the screen to refresh for most of you. Okay. So what I've done here is I've created just a little miniature script. Okay, it's a conversation between Pat, the product owner, and Peyton, the programmer. Okay, and you know what? Let me give you 30 seconds, and I'll have you read this quick little snippet here. So let me give you 30 seconds to read. So the reason I did this in a script type format is I want you to understand this was a conversation that occurred, either in product backlog grooming, or maybe it was just a conversation in a hallway or in somebody's office or something. The conversation happened. Hopefully somebody got down some notes for anything they think they might not be able to remember, right? So, and here's what I hope you notice about this particular story. It's fairly simple, right? It's fairly simple. There's just 2 or 3 scenarios. There is most expected outputs, and the test and setup and the trigger event are pretty fairly obvious, or they're really not important because they weren't really discussed. Maybe there is quite a bit of work to set up an order that has a certain weight about it, but everybody understands when we get to the point where we're going to do shipping costs, the order has to be a certain weight, and use that weight to calculate shipping costs. So that's something that the team already understands and already knows, right? In this case, because the story is fairly simple, it favors the test that pattern. I'm not saying that's the pattern you should always use. I'm just saying it favors that pattern. we have numerous inputs and outputs. Again, that favors one of the specification by example patterns. The fact that the trigger events are fairly obvious or unimportant means given when then is probably not the best approach here. So let me show you a couple of examples. So this example uses, or this possible answer to the example, uses the test that pattern. So we start a sentence with test that. So here it's pretty simple. There's basically three scenarios, right? Test is the order under 10 pounds, $25. If it's between 50, it's $35. If it's over 50, then it's $75. And we may have this understanding in our object that orders over a certain weight are not taken or something, and maybe everybody understands that, and it's already in the system, and we don't even need to mention it. Again, we're trying to achieve the shared understanding among the team. So here's a different way of doing it. This way of doing it uses the specification by example patterns. So at the top, I've got a conceptual pattern, right? The order is between 0 and 10 pounds, and it's $25 cost. If it's 10 to 50, it's 35. If it's over 50, it's $75. And I'm using a conceptual view of all the different logic scenarios. Then down below, what I'm doing is I'm doing a concrete view of all of the test scenarios. And again, I'm going to create an order that has 10.01 pounds, weight to it, and make sure that the shipping cost is $35. So this is using the specification by example patterns, this particular story. So moving on to the second example. Again, we have this conversation, and again, I'm going to be quiet here for about 30 or 45 seconds for you to read this, and then we'll talk about the characteristics of this particular story. Apparently, there's still a 1% who has not had their screen refreshed yet. I apologize for that. So here what we have is a conversation between several people on the team. Peyton's a programmer, Charles is a programmer, Bailey's a business analyst, Pat is our product owner, right? So again, a conversation that then leads to confirmations or acceptance tests, story tests. That's what we're looking to get. We've had this conversation. Now we need to create some sort of story test for this particular story. So here's what I'm hoping you notice about this particular test. I'm hoping you notice that it's fairly user interface related, which favors the test that pattern. It's fairly simple, although there's there's really not much to it, so it favors the test that pattern. The setup and trigger events are important, but they're probably not that hard to remember either. I mean, if you're using a system, you know how to log out usually. So it moderately favors the given when then pattern, but there's not numerous input and output scenarios. It's sort of just like one flow. It's fairly simple. It's fairly UI related. So for this one, I would probably favor either the test that or the given when then. So here's an example using the test that pattern. Test that when the user clicks the logout link, the system navigates to the home page. Test that after navigating to the home page, the system displays a message like, you have successfully logged out. And then there's another one, test that the logout message is highly visible and near the top of the page. And talk about how Pat, the product owner, might want to improve the aesthetics too. Again, this is part of the tight collaboration that we're encouraging with the user story practice. So these three test that sentences, I'm able to describe this behavior. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it would be using the given when then pattern, like we've already learned. Given a user that's logged in, when the user clicks on the logout link, there's the important trigger condition, right? So given a user that's logged in, when the user has clicked on the logout link, then test if the system navigates the user to the home page. Another given when then scenario would be given that a user has just logged out. So this is after they've hit the logout link. When the system navigates them to the home page, make sure it displays that message in a highly visible way. Now, for a simple test like this is a little bit on the wordy side. Um, so the given when then only moderately works here. But one of the points I want to make about all these patterns is that, number one, there's never really a black and white answer. And number two, the most important thing is a shared understanding. So if your team is very familiar with the given when then pattern, then I say use it. Now, there may be situations where using it is a little bit cumbersome, and then I would suggest looking to the other patterns. But every team, every set of logic, every requirement is going to have its own sort of flavor and complexity. And so by looking at these examples, what I'm hoping you'll do is know that it favors a particular pattern, but there is no black and white answer. Again, if you get the shared understanding, if you can minimize the amount of documentation that you're going to create, that's really what you're going for, so that you can easily, run those tests and automate those tests. Now, here's an example of where I've actually mixed the two patterns. So I've split it into two tests, and the first test uses the given when then, and then the second test uses the test at. So I thought, the given that the user's logged in, when the user clicks on the logout link, is kind of, that's the important sort of setup, and then we do the then test that, blah, blah, blah. And then the second one, the test that, it's after all that other sort of complicated stuff has happened. Then I just want to, test some user interface behavior, right? And again, remember, the user interface behavior favors the test that pattern. So you can mix and match all of these even within the same story, and I encourage you to do so. Again, use the thing that seems to describe the behavior the best, and document this in the most minimal way possible. So I'm noticing on the audience view that there's 1 to 3% of you that are getting a really late lag on the slide. So I apologize. That's completely out of my control, obviously, but hopefully I've been able to conversate in a way that you've been able to follow along. All right, we don't have time for example 3 like I mentioned before. So now we've talked about different ways of creating the acceptance criteria, and we want to automate these tests, but where should we automate them? And there's this concept out there, and there's a link at the bottom there, you can always look at it later, where Mike Cohn talks about what he calls the test automation pyramid. So, and at the base of your pyramid is unit tests, and then in the middle is the service test, and the top is user interface test. And what he suggests in this model is that you should have more unit tests than you do service tests, than you do user interface tests. And his argument for this is that unit tests are actually the cheapest to create and maintain. Service tests are the second cheapest to create and maintain, and that user interface tests are the most expensive to create and maintain. And I tend to subscribe to this theory, and I worked with a team one time that implemented this really well. So for an example of a particular piece of logic, they might have had 10 unit tests, 3 service tests, and then they only had like 2 UI tests just to make sure that the user interface was connected to the logic that was already tested in the service and unit test. And the team really did well in terms of efficiency, because at that service layer in the middle, that got the developers and the testers kind of talking, the programmers and the testers talking, and the testers would say, oh, well, if you've already tested like 10 scenarios on that, then I don't need to do it, 10 more times in the user interface. That's something that's an easy trap to fall into when you're trying to automate tests. So now let's bring this home to what we're talking about. We're talking about story tests. One question I get a lot, and an assumption that's commonly made, that's a misconception, is that all of your story tests are in the user interface layer. And that's not really the case. They can be at any layer, and I suggest that you test them at the lowest layer possible. Let me give you a couple of examples. The logout example we talked about, where the user hits the logout button to navigate it to the page, and there's a message on the page. Clearly, that's probably something that can only be effectively automated in a user interface test. I get that, okay? But let's talk about the shipping weight story, where we had to calculate shipping weight based on how much the order products weigh. And there's several different scenarios there, right? And we eventually ended up 8 or 9 different data scenarios. You could put that logic in one method in a Java class, C# or your language of choice, and run a whole 2 unit tests against it to make sure it works. Okay? And then in your service layer, you only have a couple of those tests to make sure that the pieces integrate good together, and then at the user interface, you maybe only test a couple scenarios. So what tools do you use is a question I get a lot, and the answer is it depends on what layer that you're doing your tests in. And again, I would encourage you to push to the lowest layer that you possibly can, because that's the cheapest to create and maintain. So at the user interface layer, you might use Selenium or QTP, Water. Telerik is kind of a new one on the scene that's gaining some popularity. JMeter works at the user interface level to a certain degree. At the service level, you might use JMeter or Fitness, Cucumber. Green Pepper is kind of a new one on the scene, or even any of the XUnit products, JUnit, CPP unit, NUnit, all those XUnit products and TestNG work just fine at the service layer. And that's one way to kind of get around it. It kind of depends on who's going to write your tests. Like if your programmers are mostly writing the tests, then probably they're going to prefer using the XUnit tool at the service layer. But if your testers are writing the tests at the service layer, then they probably would prefer Fitness or JMeter. Located with their product owner. And when I say co-located, I mean with the mean in the center expected behavior. So if they're small and simple. But if they get to be complex and you're not co-located, then you're probably going to need to, document using one of the other patterns.
Hey, Charles, just clarify one question.
No, I'm recommending that it's different for every single team I've ever worked on. Typically speaking, the testers will not write the unit tests. They'll write at the UI layer, at the service layer. Typically speaking, the programmers will write at the unit layer, at the service layer. And even so, but they cross over. I've seen programmers write fitness tests up in, sorry, not Selenium tests up in the user interface. I don't think I've ever personally seen a tester write unit tests. These work best with co-located. The two patterns we're going to talk about here are bullet points and test with. These are best on a 5x8 card, a wiki or a whiteboard, and again, the ALM tool is sort of the last resort. So here I've got a co-located team that can use cards instead of an electronic tool, and that's really the best situation. So here's an example using bullet points. We have a change password story like we talked about before. Somebody's wrote that there's a few things we want to be sure and make sure that it works. Maybe that's enough for a shared understanding on the team to get it right. And how will you know it's right again? And the product owner looks at it and says, yeah, that's what I want. Or when the product owner says, hey, remember I said this had to be accessible from the user dashboard? If they're saying things like that, then maybe you need to document a little bit more. But if, on the other hand, most of the time they're saying, yep, looks good, then maybe you need to document less. So then the test with strategy or pattern talks about the actual test data we're going to use, and this is referring to the test or the bullet points from the previous card. So, so we might test it with incorrect, correct, blank, current password, blank, valid, invalid, new password, things like that. So what we're talking about is testing, different features of this one little story with different sets of data. And again, we're talking conceptually. And again, some teams may be able to take this information and properly write tests and automate tests that fill all these things. You may not need a whole table. You may just work it out as part of your coding that you get through all the logic. So, and the last two, these are best if they're handwritten from a whiteboard. Because these are very visual patterns. So a flowchart is the next pattern. Remember the logout story we had? Wouldn't it be cool if this was your documentation for the logout story? You just simply, you have two screens, one with a little logout link, it goes, the logout message is at the top of the homepage. Maybe you don't need to write any words at all. And this is, again, a special case because we're doing flow, we're modeling flow. So in those special scenarios, I encourage you to use the sort of cheapest and easiest method to document the story. Here's a more complicated example of a flow chart. See on the next slide. This one's definitely more complicated. It's actually based on real live logic that was used in the team that I worked on. And, I've changed some of the details to, of course, keep trade secrets to a minimum, that kind of thing. So that's a more complicated. But then here's an example of a state diagram, again, modeled after a real-life user story where we had to track an order's status on a retail website. So again, that may be what you're looking at right now is probably too big for one story. But what you might do is highlight certain paths through the diagram, and that could be one story, right? So again, those are special cases and only rare scenarios that you need. Some of this behavior on this state diagram might be existing behavior. But again, if you have a shared understanding, if this picture tells what you need it to tell, you don't need any words on page. So in summary, don't be afraid to mix and match the patterns. Remember that story tests are the result of conversations. For beginners, I say start with the test pattern and then work your way up from there. For intermediates, start working in the new patterns where they fit really nicely. If you see one with a bunch of data scenarios, then go straight to specification by example. Try to get as many as story tests automated as possible. It's really essential to become fast without being sloppy. And then in closing, story tests are often a great way to slice a user story. You can slice it by the actual test themselves and say, okay, there's 5 rows in this table. The first story, we're going to do these 2 rows. The second story, we're going to do the 3rd row. And the third story, we're going to do the last 2 rows. You can slice your stories up by those acceptance tests. And then I've got some resources you can check out later. Specifically, I have a one-page chart that summarizes all these patterns. It's in a PDF file that's on my website. You can click that top link to get you there. And there's some other stuff supporting how to contact me, how to download the presentation, all that stuff. But I want to turn it over to thank you again for the opportunity to be here to talk today. I've enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to take questions that you want to talk a little bit about what CynerZip does for the community.
Let's just take a couple minutes or less even for CynerZip. In fact, I won't bother changing presenters. Charles, if you can flip to the next page, I'll just spend a minute or so there, and then we'll come back and take some questions. So that's more valuable. So, audience, all of you, thanks for joining us. This is just a quick intro to CynerZip. We host these webinars once a month on Agile and software development topics, and always try to pick a topic that is the heart of challenges that our teams are facing. So CynerZip is a software development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We have offshore development center in India and a small local team on the US side. For every client, we put together a dedicated team of agile team of software developers and help them essentially scale up their engineering in a cost and capital efficient way and reduce the risk of development. So next page, you can go to Charles, is just a quick overview or a glimpse of CynerZip clients. Almost all our clients are software product companies in the small to mid-size range. So with that, let's take a couple of questions that we're running into the time limit. So one question, Charles, I want to take is the touch in the beginning. It's a good question. Is you took an example of the shipping cost and where you had 25 pounds and between 35 and 50 pounds and less than 100 pounds. And the question is, we talked about not accounting for negative tests in the story also. So should that kind of an example, should there have been negative tests of a negative weight also accounted for to be a proper acceptance test?
Well, in that particular case, it's hard to say. And one of the things, again, I say, this can be different for every team, every system, whatever. But here's what I would have expected in that case. In that case, we're talking kind of about a retail website where you make an order. The short answer is I would have expected there to be a different story that either already occurs or would be separate from that story that would be about preventing the user from entering negative weight.
Mm-hmm.
So while I'm certainly never against doing negative testing, I would just have expected that to be in a different story. The part about where the system, and maybe in your system it's not possible to have an order with a negative weight, right? If all of your products have a weight of at least 0 ounces or at least 0.01 ounces, it may not be possible. So while I'm not going to tell you that it's right or wrong to put in negative testing scenarios, what I am going to tell you is that I would encourage you to exercise every scenario you think that would be important. And in some systems, yes, a negative weight would be important to put in there, but in other systems it may not, or it just may be covered in a different story. Communicating about user stories over the internet is really difficult.
Right,
So,
right. Makes sense.
because there's so much context that's at the team level.
Right, right. Well, there are a few more questions as usual, but I think I want to respect the time limit that we gave for this webinar. We are at 1 o'clock Central Time. So let's wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Charles, for joining us. This is a really popular topic by the questions, and I'll encourage everybody attending today to feel free to ping us if you want to have a dialogue or discussion on this topic, and we will make the PowerPoint as well as the recorded version available in a day or two through our website.
Yeah, definitely email me with any of your questions. I'm happy to answer.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, folks, and have happy holidays and happy New Year. We'll see you in next month's webinar in January.
Yeah, happy